Right, so this is going to be a little video about The Tide Rises, Tide Falls by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It is another one of the romantic poems, and we're going to read through it, look at how it fits those romantic qualities, and then also at the end we're going to connect it to the major components and tenets of romanticism um, that we've looked at before. All right. Tide rises, tide falls. Now, Longfellow, remember, is probably the most famous of the Romantic poets. There is a bust of him in Westminster Abbey because he was not just respected nationally here in America, but also internationally. It's kind of a big deal because a lot of British critics at the time kind of thought Americans were kind of chumps. And this really kind of pushed American poetry up a notch to be respected by them. So it's definitely pretty important. And Longfellow, some people would still argue, is the most popular and famous American poet of all time. A lot of people will probably argue some other people now, but at the time, for sure, he was the biggest poet and celebrity poet that there was. So here is The Tide Rises, Tide Falls. The tide rises, the tide falls. The twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sands, damp and brown, the traveler hastens towards the town. And the tide rises, the tide falls. Darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. The little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands. And the tide rises, the tide falls. The morning breaks, the steeds in their stalls stamp and neigh as the hostler calls. The day returns, but never more returns the traveler to the shore. And the tide rises, the tide falls. Now, with this poem, I usually talk about the fact that it definitely follows a life cycle. And there's also a strong contrast between nature as infinite and forever and going on and eternal, and then humans as being transient, evanescent, temporary, right? That humans, because of mortality, are here and then gone. Meanwhile, nature lasts forever. So one of the main things that romantics are trying to do here, in poems that are in this style, is connect themselves as a part or pattern within that bigger natural field in order to find a link to immortality. If we can be part of nature, then we're part of something that is eternal, even if we distinctly are not. So it starts off right. It's twilight. It is dusk. The traveler is hastening towards the town. We have these repeated phrases of the tide rises, the tide falls, a cycle that continues, a pattern that makes up the poem. But the idea is continual regeneration and the tide rising, the tide falls, the tide rising, the tide falls, a cycle. Okay. A pattern that continues from the beginning to the end and then circles back and continues, as opposed to humans, right? Because we have the traveler hastens towards the town. In the second stanza, right, the footprints are effaced in the sand, right? So they're erased. Made by nature is washing them away, right? So the traveler disappears. And we see in the third stanza, the traveler never returns, right? The traveler is done. The traveler has died. So these three stanzas really kind of go through the death of the traveler. But interesting enough, right? So it starts off and it's dusk. We move into darkness settles on roofs and walls. So it's nighttime. The sea remains. The sea is continuing, right? And then morning breaks. So we have this kind of moment of hope, this circulation of life, right? And the steeds are still there and they're stamping and neighing. The day returns, right? So life goes on, but the traveler is gone. So nature remains, whereas humans as distinct figures disappear. But that connection and relationship with nature kind of shows the eternity of nature and is why humans oftentimes want to become connected to nature. So as we move into the last little slide, right, we're connecting it to these romantic values, the individual above the group. We don't see that as much here, but it is just the traveler with the bigger group, right? Intuition, instinct, something that's bigger than us, that's knows more than us, that's guiding us. We do have the idea of nature here, right? And nature is definitely what is going to be creating intuition or instinct within us. Something that's more deeply woven into us than our material life. Um, Man, right, is washed away by nature. Nature is pure. Nature overcomes the rest of man's corruption. Um, Once again, the inside of us shapes the outside of us. This reflection and perspective, and the way that our interpretation of this imaginative kind of depiction is shaping the experience is unique for each of us. For sure, this next one is important for it. The idea of the symbols, the